Greetings, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program about the aesthetics of gentrification. My name is Marcia Eli. I'm the Director of Programs at the Center for Brooklyn History. Tonight is the first of two conversations inspired by the book, What the Signs Say, Language, Gentrification, and Placemaking in Brooklyn. Behind this digital curtain wait the book's co-authors and an amazing panel of speakers. Before I turn it over to them, I want to quickly share a bit about who we are and what we do. The Center for Brooklyn History is a part of the Brooklyn Public Library and holds the most extensive collection of Brooklyn-related materials in the world. Every week, we offer free public programs like this one through the library's programming arm, BPL Presents. Tomorrow night, for instance, historian Claudio Lomnitz and novelist Claire Massoud will be in conversation about Lomnitz's new book, Nuestra America. And next week, Russell Shorto and Jennifer Egan talk about fiction, nonfiction, and the reliability of memory. BPL Presents curates concerts, family programs, and much, much, much more. I encourage you to visit the Brooklyn Public Library's website, find BPL Presents, and explore what's coming up and hopefully join us. As I mentioned, tonight's conversation is inspired by the book, What the Signs Say. We are proud to partner with Vanderbilt University Press, which just for tonight is offering 30% off the price of the book. You'll find that link and instructions in the chat. You simply visit vanderbiltuniversitypress.com and use the code 15friends. Finally, I want to invite all of you to share your questions tonight. We're eager to involve you. Type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll pull as many out as possible towards the end of the hour. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's amazing moderator, and she in turn will introduce the panel. Michelle Young is the founder of Untapped New York, a web magazine and tour company focused on New York's secrets and hidden places. She's a graduate of Harvard College in the history of art and architecture and holds a master's degree in urban planning from Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where she is now an adjunct professor. She also teaches at the Craig Newmark School of Journalism at the City University of New York. She's the author of 3 books, Secret Brooklyn, An Unusual Guide, New York, Hidden Bars and Restaurants, and Broadway. Michelle appears regularly in forums of all kinds. She was recently featured on Netflix's Stay Here, PBS's 10 That Changed America, and Smithsonian Channel's Secret Cities. Michelle, everyone behind there, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I'm going to disappear and let you take it away.
Thank you, Marcia. It's always a pleasure to be here and hosting events with the Center for Brooklyn History. And I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event. So as Marcia mentioned, I'm Michelle Young, the founder of Untapped New York. And I'm very honored here to moderate tonight's event with our esteemed guest panelists. And I'm really looking forward to the lively discussion we'll be having tonight. And based on the record number of reservations we've had for this event, I think you are all as passionate about the subject as we all are behind the curtain. So I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists, and then we'll begin with a brief visual presentation from Shonna and Edward, the authors of What the Signs Say, which I highly recommend everyone getting. I have been fascinated by the book. It's full of all the things that we observe as New Yorkers, as Brooklynites, but really couched in an understanding and awareness of how to analyze it and how to make it sense in our world today. And so without further ado, Shonna Trinch is a professor and linguist, and Edward Snadjr is a professor of cultural anthropologist. They both work in the Department of Anthropology at John Jay College. Their new book, What the Signs Say, Language, Gentrification, and Placemaking in Brooklyn, examines how race, class, gender, ethnicity, privilege, and justice get deployed in the language and design of Brooklyn's storefronts and storefront signs in the larger context of gentrification and placemaking in urban space. Peter Robinson is a board member of BlackSpace Urbanist Collective and the founder of Work Urban. BlackSpace promotes a vision that, quote, demands a present and future where Black people, Black spaces, and Black culture matter and thrive, end quote. Work Urban's principal mission is to promote effective urbanism around the world. Peter also currently teaches urban theory and architecture at Parsons School of Design, and he was recently appointed to the Board of Trustees of AIA New York and the Center for Architecture. Tayo Giwa and Cynthia Gordy Giwa are the co-creators of Black-Owned Brooklyn, a digital publication spotlighting Black-owned, Brooklyn-based businesses and the people behind them. The site also documents Black life in the borough more broadly. Tayo is a photographer and media and technology lawyer, and Cynthia is a marketing executive and writer who has written extensively about issues at the intersection of race, culture, and policy. They live in Bedford-Stuyvesant with their daughter. So welcome, everyone. And Ed and Shonna are now going to do their presentation. Sorry, I have a 3-year-old at home, so if you hear a little bit of chatter in the background in the other room, that's her. And I believe their presentation is going to be pulled up shortly.
Hey, well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for that nice introduction for all of us. Thanks to Marcia Eli for bringing us all together. And it's great to meet all of you guys, Cynthia and Tayo, Peter and Michelle. And we're thrilled that so many of our John Jay College students could make it to learn about the work of everybody on the panel tonight. Do we have it? Can you guys see it? Sorry. I've got some butterfingers here. Sorry about that. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to jump right in. When we moved to Brooklyn in 2003, I felt like I was surrounded by words. These montages represent how I, as a newcomer, felt and experienced Brooklyn. I'd really never seen anything like it. In our first year living here, Ed told me that he'd gotten a good laugh from his Anthro 101 students when he complained, teasingly, Brooklyn is the kind of place where people cram as many words as possible onto a storefront sign. And the students said, well, that's old school. I was struck by how he had articulated what I had felt, and I was intrigued by the response of his native New Yorker students. I got to work trying to figure out just what kind of place all this language in the landscape made Brooklyn.
In 2010, we were awarded a National Science Foundation grant to study Brooklyn's changes, and we started by focusing on the Atlantic Yards redevelopment project. Even in the context of that massive project, storefronts became a huge part of the story. We discovered that storefronts are actually tools. They are tools that take space and make it into place. Where old school signs create an open, multicultural Brooklyn, new gentrifying signage with different aesthetics creates a place of exclusivity and even hierarchy. So let's take a look at each type. Old school signs are text dense. Their words take up all the space on the sign. They make literal references to place and to items that are sold. They repeat themselves and include extra signage. And many signs include languages other than English, but always along with English. And they often come with pictures. Most importantly, they make sincere references to identity. For example, Little Lords refers directly to Catholic rituals. Garden Tortillas earnestly suggests Chinese and Mexican food. This law firm genuinely calls out to a lower socioeconomic class by advertising free consultations. And Jennifer's salon sincerely indexes race with images and words that represent African Americans. Old School is inclusive. And taken together, these signs signal that there is a space for everyone to be exactly who they are in the Brooklyn marketplace.
The aesthetics of New Brooklyn signage contrast sharply with Old School. First, New School signs are text sparse. They have few words, and they appear in small font sizes. The words and symbols employed may invoke mystery. Languages other than English are rarely translated. When you look up the word légumin, you find that it's French, which as a noun means kid, but as an adjective means mischievous. So there's a suggestion that someone wants to play. And indeed, a common feature of New School signage is wordplay, or the witty use of language to excite the brain. Along these lines, New School signage signals learned reading practices. They link to historically valuable things and people. On this gentrifying ice cream shop, we see a line from a Walt Whitman 1856 poem, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. And here, an oyster bar called Cornelius is placed next to the street sign Vanderbilt. Together, they make a clever homage to the shipping magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt. But many Brooklynites suggested to us that these New School signs were not all fun and games. Some gentrifying signage makes ironic or mocking references to cultural identities. Here, Trailer Park, a repurposed furniture store, takes its name from lower income homes in rural areas. Here, a women's clothing store conjures Catholicism with a word that refers to attire worn by female clergy or to a shopping addiction. And here, we see an insincere reference to race with the appropriation of an African Americanism to name a shop for new mothers.
So our book provides a much deeper read into this story, and we hope that these few examples we have shown you tonight show how storefronts say a lot more than we think. They are not just mundane texts. In fact, they are powerful aesthetic artifacts that pick out particular types of people in the landscape. In the aesthetics of gentrification, we argue storefronts both make and mark the kind of place that Brooklyn has been and is now becoming. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts about all of this tonight.
Great. Thank you, Shonna and Ed. I think that gave everyone a tease of what is in your book and what we will be discussing partially today. I'd like to open up the discussion really with everyone participating and maybe addressing how signage and the evolution of signage has been a part of your work. So I know all of you are involved in many things, not just some of the organizations we mentioned, but I would love to hear from all of your experiences. So maybe we can start with Tayo and Cynthia. I'm particularly curious what aesthetic or other aspects of signage you might feel are distinctive to Bed-Stuy or perhaps Black businesses, and that might contrast with what Shonna and Ed have seen in their direct neighborhoods, and then any other things you might want to add about signage in your work.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to kind of first go back a little bit about sort of what Black-owned Brooklyn does and what we focus on and where we focus our work. We document culture and history in Black Brooklyn. And by Black Brooklyn, we mean Black communal spaces across the borough. So our work tends to be concentrated in central Brooklyn and Flatbush, but we go wherever Black businesses and Black people are, and that's kind of all across the borough. And we tell these stories about Black Brooklyn's culture and history through the lens of its businesses, because in many ways, businesses we feel are kind of like the soul of a community. They reflect the cultural traditions across the Black diaspora. They often have longstanding ties to Brooklyn. So even if a business is new, the owners tend to be people that are Brooklyn natives or have been in the borough for a long time, and they have like deep historical knowledge of the neighborhoods where they do business. They also,
yeah, I mean, adding to that, you know, we don't really have a strict criteria about the businesses we cover, but a lot of what we focus on are businesses that are much more than simply a business to the community. We find that a lot of Black businesses in Brooklyn tend to be community hubs, places where people congregate. They, have, volunteer spaces or classes for people and just community spaces. And so, when we think about, the signage and how that impacts our work, I think off the top, when we sort of write about businesses, I think people first notice the signs. And so when we write about it on our website and our Instagram, post about the signage is always the most popular. But as we drill down into some of the scholarship of Shonna and Ed, we find that within the businesses we cover, we find a broad range of signage, both the one-word signages, ambiguous meanings. We find names that are in different languages without an explanation. And so, we're not sure that we can chalk that up as into being for newcomers, because we were really focusing on spaces that are part of the community, are clearly spaces that are wanting to be Black spaces in the community. So I think it's actually really complicated within sort of Bed-Stuy, Flatbush, or Central Brooklyn. We find that there's a complex story about how businesses decide to name themselves and put up signage. So we'll stop.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think it lends to the idea that there's a larger movement about aesthetics and signage that can be driven by race or class or economics, but seems to be broader than that. So before we talk about that, Peter, I'd also love to hear from you. You're involved both academically, but also in this kind of business development space. Curious if there has been an example or that comes to mind regarding signage and aesthetics in your work.
And so again, thank you for having me here. I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. So the idea of signage has been a huge sort of influence in the work that I do, both in terms of my practice and in my academic work. As we mentioned, I'm a board member of BlackSpace Urbanist Collective, and BlackSpace has a mission that demands a present and a future where Black lives are centered, mattered, and valued. And so coming from that perspective, when we start to think about what is identity in the Black community, the role of signage always comes up as a key motivating force. In 2017, I started looking at the storefront improvement initiative that was started by New York City. It was this unique program where the city provided, actually the federal dollars provided $20,000 to improve storefront designs in the city. Jamaica, Queens was the first place where the initiative took off. It's also taken off in Brooklyn. And what that exposed, it started to help us to recognize and realize how Black business districts in particular had been defined by their signage, how spaces had become iconographic in terms of how they described themselves and how they sort of fit into the matrix of public life. The sign was as important as the body that occupied the inside and the culture of the outside. I was reminded of the cover of Jamal Shabazz's brilliant book back in the days, where you see these posed young men from the 1980s in front of sizzling chicken. Somehow the pose, the fashion, every aspect of the photograph comes into this sort of series of stark relationships with each other. You understand that that they're inextricably linked in terms of the community and the bodies and the atmosphere that foster an attitude that is very desirable when it comes to the urban environment. So as an academic, when we started to look at, well, how can we utilize a storefront improvement initiative to really challenge what was gentrification, we started to see attitudes about, and these are working with students in architecture and community members, to start to think about ways in which the signage could be this sort of exploiter of identity and culture. We were also able to utilize the BlackSpace manifesto. Our manifesto is a list of 14 guiding principles, which were made by Black community, in Black community, for Black community. Among those 14 principles are celebrate, catalyze and amplify Black joy, plan with, design with, center lived experience, and seek people at the margins. In that sort of nexus of thinking, it's a way for us to communicate with Black communities about what the sort of spatial identity and the sort of visual frontage of their environments could and should be. Some of the wonderful suggestions that came out of that, we did the studio at one time in South Jamaica, Queens, we've done it in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And in Brownsville, we had students that were working in at the side of a Pentecostal church and simply suggested ways of using lighting to take the practice of Pentecostal praise and worship into an abandoned alleyway. So suddenly the idea of signage wasn't the sort of what you're typically used to seeing, well, it's a two-dimensional graphic presentation, but it was literally suggesting that the bodies and the action of the Pentecostal church could be projected on the outside. So the actual program and how the space is used internally and the practices that we understand to be of this sort of very Black storefront church experience is projected on the outside of a surface. The actual bodies are making the sign. And so it goes back to this idea of old school sign, which I love the sort of terminology in the book, that we see it as text. We see it as relationships between words, sometimes non-standard English relationships to words. But really what it says, this is the visceral sort of exposition of a culture laid out. And the scale of the text indicates that there's just lots of nuances within how communities choose to describe themselves. And so I've taken a special kind of reimagining and deeper looking at the surfaces of buildings when they start, of businesses when they start to describe themselves. We take the example of a misspelt word, we might think, haha, but then you recognize perhaps, as you pointed out in your book, that there probably ties to linguistic tropes or different relationships to words from native speaking practices. And so all of that, I think, begins to frame an envelope of that sort of front facade of how businesses describe themselves, key and critical to how communities maintain and are able to thrive. When we start to look at new school signage or contemporary signage, and part of although I really enjoyed working with the Storefront Improvement Initiative and their graphic and their sort of catalog of standard, you start to realize that cultural specificity is starting to be lost, right? Things become stylized. I love the looking at the sort of the baby mama sort of kitsch shop, and you recognize that that's probably replacing a kind of reality that's being romanticized in almost an unfortunate way. But you see there's something that's wanting in the sign, that there's something that's no longer there in the community, but it reflects the kind of an envelope or an aesthetic reality that's still curiously desired. And so those types of signs, although we might want to see them as this sort of playing with tropes in inappropriate ways, what it starts to do is it exposes this sort of desire for a past that's being lost. There's this wonderful article.
Oh, Peter, I'm actually going to interject.
I'm sorry.
Here. No, it's okay. I'm going to interject here because I would love for Shonna and Ed to actually talk about the baby mama sign, because I know that they dug into that a bit and tell that story in the book, and I think in our conversations. So Shonna, Ed, could you step in?
This was a sign that we found in our neighborhood, I think maybe 2006, I don't remember the exact date. And it seemed a little shocking to me to see this sign, and it was a very popular place. I knew a lot of people who went there. My children were much older at the time, so I wasn't frequenting that kind of baby store at the time, but I popped in and I asked the store owner, I said, so, there's some racialized tone here to your sign. And the owner said no, there was no racialized tone whatsoever, that they liked Tina Fey, and that they were dialoguing with Tina Fey's movie, Baby Mama, which in itself we talk about in the book is somewhat problematic, and that appropriation of that terminology as well. So just as a linguist, I started thinking about what it means to be that person who gets to define what a word means, right? And to reinscribe the meaning of a word, and to be the arbiter, right? To say, well, I meant no intent that was, bad. I just love Tina Fey. And my mom, if she's on here tonight, I was telling her the story, and I remember she's the person who said to me, well, why didn't they name it Tina Fey's then? Right? They wanted to do something else. And I like what Peter is suggesting. We also kind of suggest that it harkens to old school in this way, that it refers to the customers, babies and their mothers, right? But as they do something else, they also try to invoke something else as well. And we had another friend of ours suggest that, people just want to be catchy. And again, as a linguist and as an anthropologist, we agree, people do want to be catchy, but there's a reason that those terms are catchy. And that's where we bring in some pretty powerful linguistic theory to talk about how that kind of terminology points this way and that way at the same time, so that these women gentrifiers, right, who are often affluent, that's the way that we describe gentrification, is the use of land by more affluent users all the time, right? And so, at that point, the question is, do they get to define what everything is? These people who are coming in with more means.
Yeah, because I would just like to speak maybe to Tayo's point about the diversity and different forms and features that you are seeing in signage in Bed-Stuy and elsewhere. At the same time, what we did see systematically when we started to really look at signage was in these old school forms, the features of sincerity, the features of literalness, the features of repetition, and always including English, even though there was other language. These were very consistent in our data set. And so what you are seeing, and I'm a cultural anthropologist, so one of the things I'm interested in are patterns that we don't necessarily recognize, because culture is an implicit system of symbols, and just something right before your very eyes, you may not necessarily understand what the rest of the system actually looks like. So we saw in old school kind of this very inclusive and very kind of explicit and detailed and place-oriented, format or aesthetic. And one of the things that is important about it is that these signs are up 24/7. They are one of the most public texts that you can see in urban space or in any space, and signs don't turn off. So let's take it back to the Baby Mama sign. When we asked someone, an informant we were working with, that, hey, there's a store sells, it's called Baby Mama. And she was literally like kind of blown away that she was thinking, why on earth would you have a store called that in a neighborhood? And she kind of grimaced at the title, and clearly she felt that in some sense this was offensive. And we kind of took a deeper dive into those experiences of our informants as they saw these public texts that were available anywhere, but that aren't necessarily meant for everybody.
Yeah, and I wanted to open that up to Peter and Cynthia about whether you've seen signage that is, in this case, maybe accidentally exclusionary, or has meaning that the owner didn't intend, or have we seen signage that's been deliberately exclusionary in its formation? I'm just curious if and also Shonna and Ed, if you've seen any of that out there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, like Ty was saying, a lot of the businesses that we cover actually do use a lot of the new school signage that Shonna and Ed have described. And they certainly do not see themselves as gentrifiers. You know, again, like we prioritize businesses by Brooklyn natives and long-term residents. So I also wouldn't see those signs as being gentrifying signs that are they're being pushed into neighborhoods and saying like, this is for new Brooklyn and not for old Brooklyn. That said, I think some of the business owners that we have covered have said to us that people are sometimes surprised that they're a Black-owned business, or they watch Black people walk by sometimes and like not understand that it's for them, you know, by virtue of, I mean, like honestly, they suspect that maybe because the store is nice that people think it's not Black owned, which is really unfortunate, because obviously there's like great diversity in our culture, and you know, we contain multitudes and we do all different kinds of things. So I think I wouldn't say that any of the signage is exclusionary, but I think you know, assumptions that people have about what a Black owned business looks like or what it sells can sometimes create that confusion.
Yeah, to add to that, I think there is this sort of tension in the analysis between new school and old school, but also sort of race and class. The businesses we cover in Black Brooklyn, they're owned by long-term residents oftentimes. And while we don't see exclusionary signs, we do see use of sort of that new school style with the one word names and the sort of ambiguous meanings, and so we find, at least anecdotally, talking to the owners, it's more sort of a reflection of these sort of artistic choices that they're making. And to Cynthia's point, it's actually funny, sad in many ways, that these owners will come up with these very creative ideas about names that people will think are clever, and then sometimes they'll attribute that to some non-Black proprietor, which is a little sort of jarring, right? They've sort of made it to the level where they're owning a business. They're coming up with the ideas very similar to some of their white counterparts, and then in doing that, it's almost like the analysis is that are they now looking, are they now new school and sort of not welcoming to the old school consumer? I don't know. In our sort of experience in the business we cover, we don't necessarily see that is true. But we're fascinated by the sort of analysis and the lens to look at it from.
Yeah, a lot of identity to unpack, and perhaps time that needs to pass for the public to grasp that signage can be more universal than they are interpreting it as. Peter, I'd love to hear from you, and also zoom out a bit. Sustainability of local businesses is, of course, much more than signage. And I know, Peter, you work on the community level in many ways, and I'm curious to hear if what strategies you've advised local businesses in terms of how they battle rising rents, et cetera. How can they maintain the businesses that they've tried so hard to create an identity for?
So I think part of that is leaning into the community infrastructure that have sort of supported the thrivance of these businesses. A great example to look at is Belmont Avenue in Brownsville, Brooklyn. On that street, you have sets of embedded businesses that have been there for generations, and you have sort of new businesses participating in that economic activity. And it's still largely it's a Black neighborhood. These are businesses that serve Black community. One of the sort of really interesting spaces on that street is the Youth Design Center by Gordy and Lewis Allen. And there you see, he's an architect and a community activist, or we're community activists now. But there you see at his facade, the signage is this very sleek, modernist, almost unreadable engagement with the street, non-typical to the rest of the street. But yet, and it's one of the newest spaces on Belmont Avenue, but yet you find it is this welcoming storefront because of its program and its sort of community impact relationship that it sort of built itself into the nexus of the community. And so its newness, its modern design does not sort of create an exclusionary zone. It is in fact this regardfulness that a community can be transformed and yet maintain its sort of integral ties to the community with new businesses coming in. And so in terms of how businesses can sort of sustain and maintain themselves, if you look at something like the Storefront Improvement Project, they're encouraging businesses to come in, get a $20,000 grant to improve the signage, right? What that does sometimes, it exposes the relationship between property that business owners have. Usually they're renters. That improvement project is geared towards landlord or business owners. They're encouraged to transform all the signage. And so you find that a neighborhood that used to have various styles and degrees of signage, now, because one landlord potentially owns a whole block, the street's been transformed into this generic, monotone kind of singular identity that starts to affect the ability of these businesses to sort of thrive and determine their own sort of spatial identity on the street. One of the great things that's starting to happen, I think the sort of these new regulations that are coming out of sort of the COVID guidelines, how the streets can be occupied. Now the sidewalk can be more sort of integrated in the sort of planning of the business and how it relates to the street. So now it's no longer the sign, but it's the way activity can begin to occupy the street, not just with restaurants, but there are whole sorts of ways that by simply utilizing current guidelines, the sign and the body of the street can be in this sort of communal dialogue, which pushes the activity of the business onto the street and gives it more prominence. And so now it's interesting to start to see what relationship between program and product and thrivance and how the sign participates in that. I'm excited to see how the city is now unfolding with these sort of new kind of affordances in terms of how we get to occupy the street.
Yeah, do you think that COVID-19 actually brought a lot of opportunity to revise the code? My opinion is yes. I remember just before COVID, the situation happening on Nostrand Avenue in Crown Heights, where I live, was that people were putting up new signage, not new school signage, kind of like signage with lots of lights. It was kind of exciting. And then they kept getting fined. And it led me to think about just the restrictive nature of New York City signage code and how, of course, it can also negatively impact on the socioeconomic status of who is aware of how to navigate that code, right? And so, yeah, it seems like from what you're saying, Peter, like the reorganization of sidewalk, facade, parking space in front is perhaps creating new opportunities out there.
Yeah, most definitely. There was a Jamaican restaurant in my neighborhood that were constantly being fined because they were always occupying the sidewalk. The signage wrapped around, it was a corner store, the signage wrapped around it, provided a kind of a curious awning that they always sort of encroached into the street. It was wonderful to see. They ultimately shut down, but wow, they shut down 2 years too early because now the city is giving this sort of allowance to occupy the street. Hopefully we maintain this after COVID because it adds vitality to the life of the street. It encourages more street life. And I think it gives businesses the opportunity to really sort of amplify who they are and how they participate in the neighborhood.
Yeah, New York is such a beast that it takes kind of emergency situations usually to allow for testing, which doesn't always happen in urban spaces. Shonna and Ed, you conclude in your book that language really matters. And we talked about baby mama, but I want to talk briefly about a couple other examples that you bring up. Bodega is one of them. I don't know if everyone remembers the bodega vending machine that caused a lot of controversy for a month or so. And also a big case study you do about Summerhill, which happens to be a restaurant down the block from me. And the owner lived in my building. And so I definitely want to have you guys kind of explain one or both of those situations, and we can all discuss it, because I think these are topics that these are controversies that I think the general public here listening probably have heard of.
So the Summerhill case came to our attention from a couple of different people, some colleagues who heard of it, read about it, and then we were contacted by one of the protesters of Summerhill, and we started to really, dive into the story. And there was so much available online for us to look at what had taken place. And again, as a linguist, I'm really interested in how people do things with words. And in this case, it was the apology that I was interested in. The owner had used in an advertisement a notion that her business had bullet holes in the wall. And it turned out that wasn't true. They weren't bullet holes, but there was a suggestion somehow that there were. And so she, in her press release, said, yes, the bullet holes were there, and yes, we're keeping them. And Justine Stevens was one of the protesters, and we interviewed her at length and heard her story. And like many people, when you do ethnography, they have amazing archives. And so Justine had every bit of the information that was needed. And I would go digging and reading and going deeper into, different press that was writing about Summerhill would pop up, and I would contact Justine and she would send it right to me because she had the whole part of it. This was the way that Becca Brennan, the owner of Summerhill, was protecting her privilege, her white privilege, more than anything else, more than even her business. The community wanted an apology, and she failed time after time in giving them what they were looking for. That's how we analyzed it. And she used a lot of the discourses of gentrification that were really interesting, like the anti-corporate, women-owned businesses, and this idea that she was a small fish in a big pond. She tried to suggest that all of those things were why she did what she did, or they were like excuses for them, rather than just saying, I really screwed up and I don't know enough about this community or this neighborhood. I should learn more. And
so in a nutshell, she picked the wrong aesthetic and a commitment to it. And I think this case also, and as you say, Michelle, the case of Bodega in that chapter definitely ties in with how old school and new school signage is actually encroached upon and in peril by the march of corporate redevelopment and investment. Both forms of signage are actually disappearing, and especially now under COVID, as we see businesses shuttered, the local is in danger. And I think maybe Tayo and Cynthia's work is really important for kind of providing another space where those businesses can be made public. So on the web, on the internet, and those stories and representations, it's a really important part about preserving both of the types of local signs that we see.
Yeah, I agree. I think what we've seen in COVID is, the minute someone writes about that this business is struggling, it seems to, at least in the short term, make an impact and move the needle a little bit, although we have lost many places. I mean, I reread that that Summerhill press release today, and it's pretty painful. And I think that one of the key things here is an ignoring of community history, I think in the press release, but also the response. And I think it's a lesson that, you know, for anyone forming a business to think about language, to think about signage, and to consider the community. She doesn't mention the community once in her press release. And I think if you just walk around anywhere, if she walked across the street, she would have seen the murals that are about gun violence that have been there for decades, that are next to like nearly every bodega here. So yeah, I don't know if Peter and Cynthia and Tayo have any experience with that Summerhill story, or have anything to add about that.
Well, not specifically that story, but
Yeah.
I do find that there's sometimes this romanticization of a certain type of story around the urban inner city, and it's not really consistent with the lived experience of a lot of people from the community. So, you know, when we think about central Brooklyn, you know, we in this work that we do and living here, we know that this is a bedroom community, a neighborhood of, you know, of families who know each other and live in a very sort of neighborly type of way that is in many ways idyllic. And it's been that way for years. I mean, even going back to, you know, the 60s and 70s, when sort of the, you know, Bed-Stuy had a certain type of reputation. At the same time, there were families in these communities, you know, building neighborhood and community together. You know, it's funny. I mean, people don't know this. There was actually a Black-run food co-op in the early 1970s in Bed-Stuy that, you know, I think can be said to be an inspiration to a lot of the co-ops that are now popular throughout the borough. But, you know, people don't necessarily identify that kind of, you know, activity with, you know, when they think about central Brooklyn. And so I think it's a little sad to, you know, come into the community and sort of spin sort of this narrative around gun violence where that's not the lived experience or the thing that people in the community want to uplift.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that we started Black-owned Brooklyn is, I mean, there's many reasons, but one of the reasons is that we felt like the media narratives about Black Brooklyn was relegated to stories of oppression or violence or loss or push out. And these are all important things to be highlighting, but there's this whole other universe of stories about Black life in Brooklyn that we see every day, that nourish us daily, that we didn't really feel had like a public space to sort of be celebrated collectively, like Ed said, like on the internet. It's like, exactly, that's why we did this. And so it's something that we really wanted to celebrate with this publication. There's a lot of beauty and joy and authentic experiences of family and community in Black Brooklyn, not just, you know, these sort of media narratives that you see all the time. And that's sort of a big part of our work as well.
Cool. So I would love to keep discussing. However, we have to get to some Q&A. So maybe next time we'll get into a deeper discussion about gentrification. But I do want to mention that in Ed and Shonna's book, you really do a great job explaining the different definitions of gentrification and the different what gentrifiers might look like that are not necessarily of the dominant narrative. And I think that's all that kind of nuance, whether we're talking about signage or neighborhood change, is so important, and also so important for people writing in the media to be able to capture the nuances of communities and specific communities. Okay, so we're going to get to some of the Q&A, and I apologize in advance. We won't be able to get to every question, but I do see some good stuff here. So I'm going to loop two questions together. So one person asks if some of the signage rules we're talking about are apply to digital signage. And then a signage designer asks if there are specific guidelines that we can give her that she can refer to in order to help educate ourselves and our clients. So opening that up to anyone who would like to answer that question, that combo question.
Well, I'll just jump in terms of what I discovered as someone who knew nothing about sign laws or sign regulations. In in seeing the old school signage, it actually turned out that 90% of them are actually illegal signs. That if the city wanted to find them, they in fact could, take that bulldozer out and collect a lot of money. But in terms of rules and references and guides, I do know that the city does publish certain things, and I think the state of New York has a very comprehensive pamphlet on signage, aesthetics, laws, and also ideas about how they should be made. There should be about 5 words on a sign. Now, whether you think that is a standard or is helpful in your work, I mean, the bottom line, I think, is to be creative and to put out what you want in there. And of course, there are those cultural norms that are at play that people see. In terms of digital signage, though, we didn't really do any systematic work on it, but it's a great area to explore in terms of our process and our framework, and maybe somebody will take up that study.
Peter or Cynthia? Or I can pop into the next question. You can come back if you guys have other thoughts. Okay, we've got someone who says, as an art historian, I'm excited to see a discussion of styles signifying power. I'm interested in styles fluidity, its ability to cross borders or permeate different demographics. When marginalized cultures appropriate the inside jokey / unelaborated code new school style, is this a type of social performance akin to quote unquote passing?
So that's a kind of a great question, and it taps into the previous conversation about the bodega. I'd like to say there's something about aesthetics that at its best, it is the invention of necessity. And so when you look at businesses and how they sort of present themselves, they utilize as much of the frontage as possible to both display their wares and the products that they're selling, right? You have an aesthetic at bodegas sometimes where they'll push all the products against the store window, right? So you'll see everything that the store has inside. And that's, the city doesn't like that. There are laws against that. There's a store on close to Parsons on 14th Street that literally uses that as an aesthetic, right? Where all of the same products that are in it's kind of like a play on a bodega, where the same products that are pressed against the glass of a bodega are well designed and pressed against the glass of this store, but yet it's not a problem. So whose aesthetic, whose authorship, who gets to define really talks about is when we have a conversation about aesthetic, it's who's aesthetic, who has the power, who has the authorship, who is the prevailing power of what is style and what is acceptable. You see this in many different ways when you look at store facades and sets of laws that would hinder one way of operating and then would celebrate the same thing just because the economy is different or the bodies curating the space are different.
Yeah, I mean, I think something about our work is that first of all, every time we go to a business, we ask, are you Black owned? Like we'll ask the question before we go. And then of course we do the photography showing the owners, like not as proof, but like, there it is. There are a lot of not a lot, but I mean, you will come across businesses that, maybe specialize in like New Orleans culture and like Creole cuisine or like Jamaican music. And we've seen these places identified as Black owned businesses, through hashtags on Instagram or like in articles where people didn't do that research. They just assumed, oh, this is like a Black cultural place, or it's maybe targeting Black customers, based on what they actually do. But that's actually not the case at all. I wouldn't say it's passing. It's just a matter of just like, do your research and like be clear if you're actually seeking out Black owned businesses. And then
and I'm coming from the other side of that. We know of one place comes to mind where it has classic old school signage, and it's a Black business, long time owned business that, because it's like quaint and it's a bar, and a lot of the customers are newcomers, gentrifiers who think it reminds them of their hometown bar from, you know, where they moved from before they came to Brooklyn. And so it's ironically this sort of old school place that has become a beacon for like new school consumers. So that sort of is a funny sort of flip on how sometimes these things interact.
Great. We have a question for Shonna and Ed. You refer to old school signs as being more inclusive. Aren't they just as exclusionary to those not specifically targeted and who may not understand some of the references, pictures, and language uses?
So that's a great question. And certainly, you know, there are stores that we've heard this before, like, oh, well, that Greek store is really just for Greeks. But there's no way to suggest that others wouldn't go in there, right? And it's really about being sincere about who we are, right? The business itself, like the business is saying, we're Greek. And it's okay, whoever you are. I mean, we're happy to sell to you. I mean, one of the things that kept coming to mind as we read these old school signs to be saying was, make no mistake, we will sell to everybody. And we'll do that by reiterating what we sell, by saying it in a couple different ways. We'll list it in different languages. We'll put it up pictures if you don't read. So it really seemed very inclusive, even though some of these businesses didn't do all of that. But what they did do, and I think that this is what's really important for old school Brooklyn in general, is that they held space on the street for difference. And there's this idea that I can be Catholic and you can be Muslim and you can be Jewish, and I'm going to say what I am and you say what you are, and we'll all be on the street. And that's what you really see in old school Brooklyn. And what you see in gentrifying businesses often is that all of that is being erased. New school Brooklyn is very secular, not a lot of reference often to religiosity. And it, you know, I mean, I've been looking at Black-owned Brooklyn, and a lot of the stores that I saw on your site are still sincerely saying, we're Black, right? So it has that sincerity condition that we find in old school. It's interesting also to hear that you guys are noticing that some people don't know that, right? Some of the residents, some of the Black residents are not reading that as Black. So that's fascinating to me, and I'd love to drill down more on that. But I don't think that it's exclusive to people who are not of that group. I think that they're very clear in trying to say, if your money is good money, we want it.
Funny. Okay, there was a question about Cynthia and Tayo's website, so I'm going to paste that for everybody. And then about this old school signage specific to churches, and this was a question for Peter, but again, anyone can answer. Is anyone aware of other people who have documented these kind of homemade church signs, like you mentioned?
No, I'm not aware of it, but as I was reading your book, what I wish somebody would catalog the church signs in terms of how they describe the religion or the practice. You had the one of Christ Jesus, apostolic, I think, and I noticed those quite a bit, and I always wonder about the kind of the thoroughness of the language that's used to describe, especially storefront churches. But there's one in your book that I really I said, wow, I think it was Christ, I forget, but something Christ Jesus apostolic. It was in your book, and I'm wondering if there's like that seems like there's a way to think about signage and the formality of the text and the language when church, especially storefront churches, are describing themselves. We had a great experience last fall where we worked with a storefront church in I think it was in the East New York, where the student was working with a young man who's a parishioner of the church. And as an architect, she immediately went to dramatically redesigning the storefront sign. And the church automatically rejected the idea of transforming the storefront into something that expressed the Nigerian religion. It's Nigerian Episcopal Church, storefront church. And the student wanted to create signage that expressed the Nigerian culture and the African-American culture, and the church automatically rejected that, pushed back very hard on that. And they had religious positionality that supported them, and the student didn't know where to go. And she's working with another student who's from that church, is a parishioner in the church. And what it came out to be the most important thing for the church to express on the outside was what they were actually doing on the outside, which they had a food mission on the outside. They had a learning mission on the outside. And so again, it was tapping into the sets of laws that would allow them to sort of officially promote themselves on the street and occupy the street with the program that they already have on the street. That was way more important than a kind of a sign that was an exporter of the culture. I found that to be incredibly fascinating. So it doesn't directly answer your question, but it does talk to a kind of formality about what the relationship between a church facade is, especially when it comes to storefront churches, and the program of the church. I thought was fantastic.
I'd love to squeeze in one last question. I know we have a minute left, but so someone writes, corporate influence / interference with local signage was mentioned. Can any of the panelists speak to if they found attempts at corporate / chain signage to appropriate specifically local norms, sort of in the same way corporate owned beer brands present themselves as standalone microbreweries, etc.? No examples?
Well, there was an example. I mean, we did see some examples, like of Subway. There was a Subway Sunset Park, right, or something like that. We have seen the corporate intent to appropriate Brooklyn in different ways, but I can only think of this one example right now, but I'm sure there were others. Do you remember that?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of examples beyond beer.
I think McDonald's does this really well, not necessarily in Brooklyn or New York City, but like in my hometown, there's on Long Island, there's like rules about aesthetics. And so the McDonald's is like this super cute East Coast looking thing.
Yeah, the problem with corporate is that corporate signage and corporate logos and corporate anything are basically placeless, and they're designed to be that. That is how they function. That is how they are, as profitable as they can be and can go anywhere on any landscape. So I don't think I've seen that much, if at all. And it is part of the mission of the corporate to not actually be local.
I think it reminds me of when you talked about the Summerhill story, that the community actually said, we want businesses like this here because we don't want corporate businesses. And it's the debate is much deeper than the signage or et cetera. There was a question about wanting to know more about Bodega and Summerhill. So I know we don't have time for that, but it's in the book. If you Google, you'll see the host of stories that have come out about both of those. And they're just both fascinating case studies. So I would like to thank everyone for attending tonight and for the panelists for being here and showing us their expertise in this subject. Thank you to the Center for Brooklyn History and BPL Presents for hosting this evening. We're going to have a round 2 of What the Signs Say in about a month. And we will be talking there about more about the aesthetic of gentrification, also about nostalgia and signage. So please join us for that and check out everything else that's on the schedule for the Center for Brooklyn History. And have a great night, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
It's great to meet you.